I met Yogi Bhajan for the first time on December 22nd, 1968. I had gone to the East-West Cultural Center, which was at that time downtown LA, 9th and Vermont, because Dr. Judith Tyberg, who ran the place, was a friend. I had studied Sanskrit with her, and my son had gone to school. She had a school for children. And Yogi Bhajan was there as a visitor. So I was introduced to him, and I thought, who is this guy? He had these incredibly beautiful, loving eyes. They were just magnificent. He was thin at that time. He's 6'3". And after her lecture, 8 of us went out to dinner, and I was sitting across from her at a table. We actually went to the SRF, used to have a restaurant, and I was sitting across from her, and then there was a gentleman next to me, Yogi Heckel was his name, a German older man who was quite well known, and then somebody else, and then there was the yogi at the end. And during the dinner, he leaned over and looked at me, and he said, "Your son's in trouble, isn't he?" And I said, "Yes, he is." He said, "Well, I can help you. Come and see me." So the man, Yogi Heckel, said, "Well, when a yogi says that, you should listen." My son had enlisted in the Army, which of course was a big mistake, and after 2 days tried to commit suicide, fortunately unsuccessfully, and then went AWOL. And I'd received a letter from him in September saying, "Next time you hear from me, I will be in Canada," which is what the boys were doing during that war. So on Christmas Day, 1968, I went to see Yogi Bhajan at the East-West Cultural Center, and we sat in Dr. Tyberg's office. She was away at Point Loma, where she was one of the first children born at the Theosophical Society. So she had gone there for the holidays. So he and I met, and he told me all about how he had come to Canada and then come to the United States. He had actually just come for the weekend. And I had a great deal of trouble understanding him. His accent was very thick. And after telling me about his adventures, then he started telling me about my life, and he was right on the dime. And he said that he oft quoted nowadays in 3HO, he said, "You've been cheated and betrayed by a spiritual teacher. I'll make it up to you." That's a whole other chapter. And I thought, okay, sure. And then he said, "I've come to train teachers, not get students." He says, "You've been a student long enough, and you should be a teacher." And I was taking it all with a grain of salt. And I felt kind of sorry for him because he didn't really know anyone. And so I offered to drive him the next day. And so I started then being his chauffeur and tour guide and, in a sense, translator of American culture. The thing that he gave me to do for my son was to chant. He told me to chant every morning for 1 hour, what we call long ekongkars. But in those days, there was no breathing connected with it. He said to do it all in one breath. Ek Onkar Satnam Siri Wahguru. I had a little bit more lung power then. And so I said, but what about all the other things I'm doing? Because I had been to India, I had studied with other teachers, I had my Sufi chant, my Hopi meditation, my Vedanta thing. He said, fine, do all those, but try this also. So I thought, well, that's fair. He's not trying to rope me in. So I sat down with a piece of paper next to me because I couldn't remember the words, and I belted it out like you would not believe. And in fact, it was so loud that within a few days, the landlord called me. The neighbors were complaining, and I, of course, ignored that. And the thing is, the second day that I chanted, I felt the power come in that is just inherent in those syllables. And while I was chanting, of course, I was mentally merging the syllables with a prayer for my son's well-being. And in about 10 days, we actually heard from him, and we were able to get him out of the Army without a dishonorable discharge. And so things worked out at that point in time. But I was sold on the chanting, and I knew that I had to keep going with it. The police came one morning to my apartment when I was still quite, powerful with it. They were very polite, the LAPD, two young guys. They came to the door, and I let them in, and they said, "Do you have the radio on in here?" And I said, "No, I'm chanting." They said, "Well, could you do it quietly?" Yogi Bhajan was out of town at the time. So then I moved my chanting over to the place we were using for yoga classes, which actually had been Jules Bucheri's antique shop on Melrose and Robertson. And so I would go there and chant. And when Yogi Bhajan came back to town, I told him what had happened. He said, "Well, you could have done it softly." When my son died, I was determined to hold it as a celebration. I wanted to get balloons, and Yogi Bhajan came to the memorial service at Forest Lawn. And he came in just about at the time I was getting ready to get up and speak. And he started to stand up. I said, "Well, I'm going to talk." He said, "Well, hurry up, hurry up." I mean, just very casual about it. So I gave my little talk about my son. And then he got up and he said, "Well, that's Shakti's version." But he says, "Now I'll tell you." And he said that my son had been born just to get me on this path, which is why I started doing sadhana. And which is how he really got me in the beginning, was telling me there's nothing more powerful in the world than the prayer of a mother for her son. And so that's what I teach people. And he would encourage everybody. I mean, he set me up, of course, as the mother of 3HO. And when he suggested it to me, I said, no, I don't want to be. I've already had my son. I don't want to. And when my son was in some troubles and problems, Yogi Bhajan said, "Leave him alone. You've got to stay away from him." He said, "I'll give you thousands of sons," which he did. Everything he said he would do, he did.